Chapter 5. Issachar woke Beniyim and whispered the plan to him in the garden, just as Jerutha had done for her. When she finished, he straightened and looked at her. In some ways, Beniyim and Issachar were the closest of their siblings because they remembered their mother and the desert. But in some ways, they were as distant as two stars because they were so different. He was quiet and tall, self-contained and often withdrawn, while Issachar was impetuous and reactive, quick to blame or cry, ready to make up right away. Ben had taken this terrible news of Kital's sending, and he had run. Issachar had stayed and blown up at her father and received the penalty. Now she saw Ben trying to make sense of what she was saying. "Just leave?" he whispered. "How can we let them take one of us again?" Issachar said. She used what she knew would shake him. "Our mother's last baby." Deeply protective of their mother, Ben had been devastated by her death. He nodded, staring at his hands, long and deep brown, wrapped around his thin legs. "We'll need my bow," he said. Every year the men of the village hunted when the deer came through in the hot season, heading north. Beniyim had gone out with them for the past 2 years. Last year he had taken his first deer. "And some rope." He looked at her then, and she saw sorrow and guilt in his eyes as they skittered over the cuts on her face. He reached out to touch her hand, careful of the cuts on her knuckles. Then he stood and went quietly toward the small shed behind the house. Issachar saw him drawing himself together, moving into the practicalities of what they would need to pack. She smiled. Her face hurt as her smile pulled at the deeper cuts, but she knew that she had him beside her, and though Beniyim was quiet, with him she felt they might have a fighting chance of surviving. She told Ibba only that she needed to obey when Issachar told her to run. 7-year-old Ibba was tiny next to Issachar and Ben, who were both tall for their age and long-limbed. Ibba was petite and wiry, full of energy, her eyes huge in her small face. She had skin as smooth as silk, deep brown like the earth in the freshly plowed fields during the planting season. Issachar whispered the words to her little sister as she braided her hair to prepare for the sending ceremony. She smoothed oil through 4 large sections of Ibba's tightly curled hair, rubbing the oil into her scalp and smoothing the strands, then winding sections into long twists that fell to Ibba's shoulder blades. Issachar had done the same with her own hair earlier, pulling it apart to get rid of the tangles, the way her mother had always done for her. Now she had to do it for herself. "It'll be okay," she said to her small sister, lying through her teeth, because how could she be sure of anything, shaking with love and fear and energy to run? She was barely sure of her own name, and the ground under her feet seemed shaky and strange. Were they leaving? "Tomorrow you only need to listen and be absolutely silent. We're going to get Kital back, and you can't tell anyone what I'm telling you now." Ibba's eyes flooded with tears, and as Issachar finished with her hair, winding a cord around the finished twist, Ibba ran back to her sleeping mat and wrapped her arms around Kital, who was napping. The little boy murmured and cried out in his sleep, and Ibba squeezed him tighter. The ceremony would happen at dawn the next day. The rules of the goddesses dictated that the great field gates must be shut and locked until noon on the day of sending, keeping everyone inside the walled village. The villagers would push the boat off into the black, choppy sea, then walk back through the sea gates, leaving their beloved children to drift off into the ocean. If they stayed to watch, they risked the anger of the goddesses. Jerutha hoped these rules would save Issachar and her siblings, the people compelled to move back into the village. Perhaps the 3 children would not be missed until later, when it would be too late to stop them. Issachar was terrified, but she looked at tiny Kital on his mat and felt the heat of strength and resolve flowing through her trembling arms and legs. The day passed so slowly that Issachar wanted to scream. She made the breakfast tea and gathered the wood as usual. This time she met no one in the forest. She used a headscarf to hide her bruised and cut face. Full of nerves, she couldn't look at her father as she brought his tea to him in his sleeping room. She hoped he would attribute her silence to yesterday's beating. They ate the day meal. Ben tromped around the yard, gathering various supplies. Jerutha pulled the clean sending cloths off the clothesline, and Issachar helped her fold them. Kital and Iba sat in the garden, their heads bent together as Kital drew pictures for Iba on the ground with his finger. The house was oddly silent. No one dared speak in case the hope in their hearts was audible in their voices. Issachar's father stayed on his mat all day. He had tired himself the day before, stomping around and swinging his cane. In the afternoon, Nirloth called to Issachar. She and Jerutha were quietly setting aside part of the day meal for the children to take with them. Issachar looked at her stepmother, her eyes wide with fear. Jerutha looked back at her with steady eyes, then bent her head and whispered, "Go," she said. "You must." The room smelled bad again, and Issachar felt reluctant to walk in, but her father beckoned her to his side. Pain rushed through her as she limped to him. She kept her face blank. "Daughter," he said, his face a shadow on his pillow, "you must resign yourself to the way." There was no anger in his voice. Issachar was silent. She stood with her eyes on the floor as a proper worker would, though every cell in her body screamed in protest. She would not resign herself any longer. Issachar had lost a sister and a mother to the way. She was finished with resigning herself. "I have decided to train you up as a priestess, Issachar." Despite her resolve not to look at him, Issachar's eyes flew to her father's face. He went on, "Benny is not the right choice. I know this now. He doesn't have the heart of a priest in him. He will be nothing more than a regular worker." This was her father at his most appeasing, his rough voice as soothing as he could make it. He told Issachar this news as an apology. He had hit her, true, but see, he was training her to take his place. A single square of sunlight shone on the dirt floor. Many people in the village had slate in their houses now, but Issachar's father insisted that the old ways of dirt and stone were enough for their family's ground. "Do I have a choice?" she asked, hardly able to get the words out. She dared another look at her father, now that her eyes had adjusted to the dim light. He lay in his corner on the bed mat, his face grayer today. His hands lay listless by his sides, and he looked out through the small window, rather than at her. He frowned. "Of course not. You are a worker. None of us have choices. We do what we are destined to do. The goddess, Fate, rules over us in totality. The only satisfaction is through following carefully in her footsteps. You may have questions, Issachar." Now he looked at her. "But you are full of spiritual power, and you will be a great priestess." She flinched when his gray eyes met hers. His words confused her. Everything had changed in the night. Yesterday, she may have welcomed his words because at least being a priestess would set her apart, keep her from needing to marry. She knew that otherwise she would be at a disadvantage, looking for a husband to take her on the merit of her cooking ability or her willingness to work hard. She was one of the black outsiders who lived with the priest, and no one would happily choose a wife who may bring bad luck, someone with the shame of being different. But today the world had shifted, and Issachar was about to spit in the face of the goddess Fate. She thought of Kital, and confusion fled. Issachar was utterly sure that she would follow her baby brother and get him out of that boat, goddess or no goddess. She nodded to show she had heard her father's words, and looked down at the square of sunshine on the floor, silent. "You may go," her father said. The evening passed, and Issachar lay down on her sleeping mat early, Kital in her arms. She stared into the dark, knowing she needed to sleep for strength. But she was nearly crazy with the feelings that washed over her. Fear, curiosity, dread. What if they couldn't row hard enough to reach him? What if they died in the wilderness? What if one boy with a bow wasn't enough to care for them? Life had been hard but predictable just 2 days ago, when all Isaac had to worry about was whether her father would check the firewood. She couldn't imagine how to approach a new life. Workers were raised for obedience. What would become of them? It didn't matter. They were leaving. They could not abandon Kital to the waves. Somehow, Issachar drifted off into the relief of sleep. She slept only a few hours before Jerutha woke her. In the dark of the early morning they gathered what they needed. They would not eat or drink tea before ascending. Issachar shivered without relief. She hoped that people would assume that she feared for her brother, which was partially true. Issachar went over the steps in her head. They needed to push him out in the boat, then make sure they trailed behind the other workers as the people filed back through the sea gate. Issachar and the others couldn't run until almost everyone was back inside, and hopefully they wouldn't be spotted. Yesterday, Benyim had taken the bundle of supplies to the small boat that was hidden among the rocks. He was skilled at getting into difficult places without being seen. Issachar supposed it was from trying not to be noticed for his whole life. Now she saw Ben emerge from the sleeping room and met his eyes briefly. This morning he was responsible for ringing the bell to announce that the sending was imminent. Issachar watched as Ben picked up the heavy bell. He held her gaze for a moment before turning and sealing their fate with 6 rings of the symbolic instrument. The bell rang out over the flat, dusty earth, vibrating to the sea's edge, to the boats on the harbor, all the way to the richer houses that sat at the borders of the village, far away from the stench of the fishing boats. Issachar thought she could sense people preparing themselves for ascending, scurrying around, opening the gates in front of their houses. Nothing would ever be the same. She knew nothing of the future. She felt that they were standing on the edge of a cliff. Perhaps she was leading her brother and sister to their deaths. She shook herself and gave Kital his sending tea, singing their song to him until his eyelids were too heavy to stay open. They drifted shut, his beautiful eyelashes resting on his cheeks. Nearloth came out of his room, stiff in his long black robe. He walked out of the house without looking at any of them, leaning heavily on his cane. Benyim followed. In the courtyard, Iba fetched the donkey. Issachar passed Kital up to Ben after he mounted, taking care to tuck Kital's head against Ben's shoulder, so it wouldn't bounce around on the rocky path to the shore. Nearloth opened the gate, muttering the sacred words as they passed through the wall. Issachar looked back at the house as she passed through the gate, a final glance at the place where she had last seen her mother, and then she turned to follow the others. The workers filed to the harbor from every direction. Some were missing, Ben could tell, from his perspective on the donkey. Even the richest of the workers were not very wealthy. Still, they could afford to pay the temple for the privilege of missing the sending. Ben had witnessed the payoff happening many times in the temple, when the warning music vibrated through him at the exchange of money. But most of the villagers were present. Since he had become the priest's apprentice, Ben had never missed a sending. He felt a sudden hope that this would be his last. It fizzled when he remembered that first they needed to escape, a dangerous thing. The people drifted together to the sea gate. Ben's father spoke the sacred words over the gate, and the workers filed through with bent heads, walking out to the harbor. Ben saw Faiza. The tomato seller put a gentle hand on Issachar's shoulder. His sister flinched, her wounds hurting her, and Ben winced in sympathy. "May your eyes be guarded, Issachar," the woman said. "And your speech kept safe," Issachar replied. The woman said nothing more, but she walked by Issachar's side as they made their way to the harbor. Ben remembered buying tomatoes from Fiza on days when Issachar was too busy to go to the market. He remembered her smile back when her baby was small, before he was given over during that horrible season when Fiza's family farm had a tomato blight. She didn't smile much anymore. As Ben watched, she bent her head and slipped back into the crowd of workers. He caught a glimpse of the harbor as the villagers walked down, only a murmur here and there breaking the silence. Ben kept his eyes away from the dark shape of his father at the head of the procession. He didn't want to think of his father too much, afraid that he would lose the nerve to break free at the last moment, if he considered his father's heavy anger. Ben's heart was pounding until it seemed that it would rise into his throat. He looked down at the sleeping boy in his arms, and as he did, he heard a clear, lovely note. The burst of sound surprised him, and he looked around, but soon realized that it had come from within him. His arms tingled with it, a single centering vibration through him. Yes! Gazing into his brother's sleeping face, he felt it rise inside him, filling him with sound. It wasn't the painful ring of discordant music or ominous drums. This was peace, like sleep and waking all at once. This was his hope in leaving, the reason he had agreed to run with Issachar. Ben wanted peace. Maybe he would find it somewhere far from this village. He lifted his head, staring straight at his father at the front of the procession, and the peaceful feeling didn't fade. The water of the harbor was dark and foreboding. Sending day after sending day, the workers sent their children out into the gray, rough sea, watching until the boats disappeared around the rocks into the open waters. "This is not the true way," Ben's mother had whispered to him on Arya's sending day. "This is not the way of the true one. Remember it, Benaim." At the time, Ben was crying so hard that he couldn't see. He didn't need her words to tell him it wasn't right. The wrongness of it shook him like a leaf, drums that rolled and threatened to tear him apart from the inside. Not today. Today his eyes were dry and hard, his muscles tense, ready. The sending boat bobbed beside the pier, tied by a single fraying rope. Jerutha looked at Ben solemnly as he passed Kital to her to dismount. When Ben was on the ground, he took his little brother in his arms again, carrying Kital to the small boat and laying him inside on the largest cloth, the red one for sacrifice. Issachar and Jerutha arranged the sending cloths over him, taking care to wrap him loosely so he could move if he woke up. The crowd chanted the dirge-like, mournful songs, beginning with the song of the goddesses and moving to the songs of sending. Issachar and Jerutha stepped back as the songs finished. 3 strong men approached. They waded into the water and pushed the boat out toward the sea with great strength so it could reach the spot beyond the small harbor breakers where it kept going and didn't come back. Boats had washed back in the past, but the small vessels were only for sending, never receiving. The children were sent again, and it was even more heartbreaking the second time. Kital looked small and pale in the boat, his brown skin lacking its usual warmth. His eyes were closed. "We will come for you," Ben told his small brother silently. "Hold on, little one, we're coming." The men gave one last push with all their might. The tiny boat rocked for a moment, then righted itself and went out in the current, drawn toward the opening in the rocks and the great sea beyond.